Hello, I am Anaboltos, and today I am actually going to answer some questions that I was being asked because I asked people to ask me questions, and therefore I now have some questions to answer. Now, I only really got, let me think, how many questions did I actually get? Four questions, but I'm going to start with the simplest question that probably is going to have the shortest answer right off the bat. And that question is, where are you from? Where am I from? So, of course, this question asks me where I'm from, and the answer to that is that I'm originally from Germany. I was born in an area historically known regionally as Baden, but in in today's political political divisions in Germany, it's Baden-Württemberg is what it's called because it got combined with Württemberg and also with Hohenzollern. So you got a brief bit of historical lesson there as well, although I was born after all that happened. But I just wanted to give you some specifics on that. Now, I'm not going to get too much deeper into that. The reason being that if I get any deeper into where I'm from exactly, it'll really mess with my privacy, and I don't really want to do that at this point in time because I haven't showed my face on the internet. I'm currently relatively private, so I'm not really willing to add too much to that, but I did actually live in Lombardia in Italy for a while as well, just if anyone was wondering. So English is actually my third language after German and Italian. However, I have definitely a lot better experience with English, so English is probably the language that I speak best out of those languages. Okay, so the next question I'm getting here is, of course, the very, I would say, historical question to some extent. Please analyze the ethical aspects of the British rule of India. So that's a question that's asking me to analyze the ethical aspects of the British rule in India. So you might be asking, well, how did this all happen in the first place? So let's take a brief tour for history. Okay, in around, I think it was the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England chartered the East India Company, which was a private company, and in fact remained a private company. By that I mean the lands that they had were private until around 1858 or 1857. It was 1858. Sorry. Okay, in 1858, the British took over from the British government took over the lands that the East India Company had ruled over in the past. And from there on, the British ruled India directly, eventually proclaiming the Empire of India, which the crown was given to Queen Victoria, who also became the Empress of India, until eventually, I think shortly after World War II, India gained its independence. So the East India Company had its own army, which at some point in history was even larger than the proper British army itself. And they originally acquired land as, I believe, trading posts in India, and eventually managed to expand their rule over the following centuries by wars that the European powers fought against each other, would lead their colonies or their companies to fight against each other as well. In addition to that, wars among the Indian states, oftentimes the Indian leaders sought assistance from foreign powers in order to gain the upper hand in their wars. That also led to some conquests. In addition to that, sometimes the Indian states and the colonial powers fought against each other directly. And that, of course, also led to eventually the British ruling all of India in an area that I think corresponds today to Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar, and some other areas as well. And they tried to get Afghanistan as well, but they didn't really succeed very much with that. So now for the ethical aspects of it. Now, of course, I think that a good ethical thing to always look at is when you're taking somebody else's land, you need to ask yourself why are you taking that land. If you're just waging a war because you want to take somebody else's stuff, that really isn't that much better than an armed robbery. In fact, it is practically the same thing as an armed robbery, just on a much larger scale. And also, there are abuses that occurred under British rule in India. I think that is something that does also need to be acknowledged. And I think that it definitely could have been managed better. And therefore, there are some ethical problems with it in the way that the British went about taking control of India. I think is unethical to some extent. In addition to how many of the Indians were treated under British rule. That was also a bit unjust as well. If there was something specific that you really wanted me to touch on, then please do tell me in the comments section below, and I will make a separate video specifically talking about that. Because, to be honest, although I do read a lot of history, this isn't one of my best areas, talking about the British rule in India. That isn't something that I have studied too much, so I can't really say that much more about it than what I just said. So anyway, moving along, the next question is of a financial nature. Which stocks do you recommend? So I think I have a relatively non-standard outlook on the stock market. And it might be because I'm not very educated on this, or it could be because I am highly critical of many of its aspects. But, of course, the basic principle when buying stock or trying to exchange goods is to, of course, buy low, sell high, which means that the best time to buy, in theory, would be when there's an economic downturn. So if you're at a point in your economy where things are going up, then it probably isn't the best time to buy. It's probably better to buy when you're at the very trough of a depression, which, of course, is the time that most people would want to sell in order to keep up with their expenses. So ideally, you would need to have a stable job so that you don't end up having to sell all your stocks at a loss in a depression, as happened to many individuals in the Great Depression. But there's a few other things involved here as well. And of course, when looking for stock, you always should look for something that you think is going to be successful. And that, of course, is probably one of the most difficult parts of buying and selling stocks, or just trading stocks, if you want to just condense it into one verb. It can always be tricky figuring out who's going to make it big, and that's always a really big risk. Now, of course, you can go with mutual funds, where there are experts who look at these things, who you can decide how risky you want them to be with your stocks, and they can choose to possibly invest in something that's very stable, or perhaps you may want to try to get something a bit riskier, but of course the risk means that if you don't make it, you lose. However, on a deeper issue in the stock market, one thing that always concerns me on a philosophical level is that the stock market ends up artificially messing with the price of goods, in the sense that the prices of the stocks are independent, in a sense, from the success of a company. And that means that if you buy a lot of a stock, the value of the stock is going to go up, even if the company's actual, I guess you could say, total value of all the goods and services that a company provides don't change. You can raise the value of it. And the same thing with selling a lot. And a big example with this is some things that George Soros has done. He famously damaged the economies of several countries by short selling. And this means that the reason that the Great Depression happened is partially because of the very existence of the stock market, making such a rapid change in prices even possible. And this also means that industries that aren't even related to one another can rise or fall in stock prices depending on where the stocks are. So I personally think that the stock market isn't simply something that is an individual risk, but the very existence of a stock market, although it allows an economy to move a lot faster, it also allows it to fall apart a lot faster. So it is not simply a risk in the sense of an individual risk, but it is a national and even an international risk, depending on which stocks you're talking about. So that's my thoughts on the stock market. That's why I'm still on the fence as to whether or not I personally should even get involved with it. I think it's a lot better to invest in actually owning things in a direct manner, such as buying land, which is something that is probably a lot more stable in value than stocks. Land is, of course. And in addition to that, a big principle to not only being rich, but making sure that your wealth lasts is the concept of always buying and never selling. And if you do that with land, you end up eventually having a lot of land and having a lot of influence. And that is something that historically has been very important. In addition to that, buying a lot of stocks and holding a lot of stocks, you can get plenty of dividends, but also it allows you to have a greater say in the manners of a company. Now, of course, some governments don't like it when people do that. So you always need to be careful, because the government may be coming down on your back in a very unpleasant manner, which is not very fun, if I do say so myself. So anyway, I thank you all for... Wait, no, I'm not even done. There's one more question. There's one more question. Of course, the final question, and probably the most controversial question, because the first question was something that was entirely uncontroversial, that was simply stating a fact. The second question was something a bit less controversial that a lot of people can probably agree upon. The third question was really just opinion, and the final question is something that has in recent times become actually a matter of discussion. Although it has been a matter of discussion for decades, it is something that, because of the things that Donald Trump has said, has become more to the forefront of the general public, especially in the United States, even though it was well known among certain individuals that this debate was even going on. But anyway, the question is global warming caused by human activities, and is global warming a problem? Okay, now that is a very big question. So I think, generally speaking, most people can agree that climate change exists, and that it's happening all the time. But the problem, of course, comes in with what kind of climate change, and what is the pattern of the climate change, and what are the causes of the climate change. So the question that I was asked specifically talks about global warming, which, interestingly, I would like to point out, is a term that generally has in parlance been slowly replaced by the term climate change because of, let's just say some embarrassing events. But anyway, the climate has been changing around for many centuries, and the question becomes, how is that related to human activity? Now, there are a few related issues to this, and of course, one issue is that, of course, anything that happens in the entire universe will have an effect on the Earth's climate, because theoretically speaking, you can look at gravity, and everything in the universe is somehow connected on a level with gravity. So those distant stars are going to have an effect on the Earth's climate, just a very minute effect. And so whether something actually has or does not have an effect on the climate isn't so much a question as to what extent it has an effect on the climate. Now, that being said, there were some studies that said that aerosols, which are in some instances believed to, specific kinds of aerosols, are believed to have an opposite effect to greenhouse gases, and therefore, in theory, would help the climate cool. Apparently, the effect of aerosols in the climate has actually been overestimated in the past. Now, this means that, in theory, also the effect of greenhouse gases in the climate has also been overestimated, which means that greenhouse gases aren't quite as powerful regarding climate as people used to believe. Now, that being said, I don't think it is fair to say that humans don't have a significant effect on the climate, because of course they do. For example, if you live in a big city that has a lot of paved roads, of course the temperature in the town is going to be warmer because of human activity, because of vehicles, because there aren't that many barriers for the heat to seep into the ground, and you're just going to live generally warmer in a city. And this is a very localized climate effect. And one specific example that I can think of is that when I was living in Italy, I went to Milan, or Milano, or Milan, depending on whether or not you speak an accent. I went to the city, and I lived outside of a city in an outlying town. But in the city, it was raining. But outside of the city, it was snowing. And the reason it was raining in the city was because the warmth of all the human activity and the technology in the city warmed up that localized region, which caused what would have been snow to instead melt into rain. And that is a true example of what you could say is a localized warming effect. Now, that being said, it is also true that the world in some past years was actually hotter than it currently is. And I'm not even talking about the 2000s, where it was believed things were going to go up and we were going to lose the ice cap, and Al Gore made all his predictions with an inconvenient truth, which, by the way, ended up not actually really coming to pass. But instead, we then saw a few years later the ice caps actually expanded a bit more with their ice. But still, in those years, many so-called scientists continued to use old images of the ice caps shrinking without showing more current images of the ice caps growing, in order to prove a point in a manner that I think is quite deceptive. In addition to that, there was also a graph on a government website that I saw once that the line on the graph that was supposedly a horizontal line wasn't actually horizontal, in that the graph was actually tilted a bit, so that on the temperature graph, where you would see the temperature going up and down, and slowly rising, it was tilted to make it look like it was rising more than it actually was. And of course, this really calls into question the integrity of the scientists involved in this. Now, this, of course, isn't the same thing as saying that these things didn't happen. But another thing I'd like to point out is that in the past, there are some areas in the world where viticulture, the growing of grapes, specifically historically for the purpose of wine, and still today, I've helped some harvests once in a while on viticulture. They used to grow farther north than they do now, which implies that the temperature used to be higher than it is now in the medieval warm period. And this is something that is true. Now, of course, another thing that shows that there is there are some issues here is that when calculating the global temperature, there are some problems that arise when you figure out that the methodology or the sources of these temperatures aren't actually the same all the way through since when these temperatures were first measured. The problem that this puts on a scientific level, on the scientific method, is that it introduces variables that would make it harder to actually achieve a conclusion. By the simple fact that some areas were not measured until a couple decades ago. There are areas that used to be measured but aren't measured anymore. And this is true all over the world, which means that we can't really put together that reliable of a historical record on global climates. Now, of course, there are some hints from plant life and from historical accounts, but I think one of the biggest hints is that viticulture that I was talking about, where areas of England that you can't grow grapes on now used to be actually pretty good for that. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you can't grow grapes in England. There are areas in England where you can grow grapes. It's just that they're not quite as far north as they used to be in the past, which means it's colder than the past today. In addition to that, another big example is Greenland. And people always talk about Greenland and Iceland, and they say, what a deceptive name. But actually, if you look at the historical record of when Greenland was first being settled during the medieval warm period, you can find that agriculture was possible and that it in fact was a lot greener than it is today. And I think that's something that also points to the fact that the temperature definitely isn't as hot as it used to be. So when people are worried about the global temperature rising a few degrees, I would tell them that they don't have to be worried about this, because it's happened in the past and it's probably going to happen again in the future. But what we do have to be careful about is pollution. That is something that we have to be careful about. But one thing that we shouldn't really worry about as much as many people involved in climate science are worried about is carbon dioxide. Now, the reason these people are worried about carbon dioxide is because it's a very common not fossil, what am I even talking about? No, it is a very common greenhouse gas. And of course, the burning of fossil fuels releases a lot of greenhouse gases, which is why I said the word fossil then. But because my brain made that connection. But carbon dioxide is also known to promote the growth of plants. And speaking from paleontology, we can look at some fossils of plants that, linking back to fossils there, that lived in what we can discern was probably a higher carbon dioxide concentration than that which we have in the atmosphere today. And surprise, surprise, a lot of these plants are significantly larger than their counterparts today. And it is known that increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere definitely does help and promote the growth of plants, which would increase crop yields and also increase food, which would help combat world hunger. So honestly, I think some people are really working in the wrong direction on this. But another thing to note is people say, well, it's going to get really hot in the tropics. And the problem with saying that is that the hottest areas in the world are actually the areas where there are hot deserts, rather than just the tropics in general. Even though the tropics are a bit hotter, the hot deserts are definitely top of the list there. And the reason for that I'm saying this is because if you look at the tropical jungles, they're not as hot as the hot deserts, and those areas are very livable for the people that are used to living there, of course. Now, of course, if you take someone from Hammerfest in Norway and you move that person all the way down to Equatorial Guinea, that person probably is going to take some time to acclimate himself to the region before really getting used to it. And I think that's true with anywhere in the world you go. You may have some problems with altitude. You may have some problems with the climate differences from places where you lived. But for the people that actually live there, they're doing fine. They're doing just fine. In fact, there's people that live in sandy deserts that do fine as well. So I don't think that the heat is so much the problem here as many people make it out to be. So, to answer the question, is global warming caused by human activities? It is, human activities are a contributing factor to climate change. However, it does also need to be said that a lot of these things are natural as well. But nevertheless, humans do need to be aware of to which extent they are affecting the surrounding climates so that they don't end up messing up big time. And is global warming a problem? At the current level of temperature in the world, it is not a problem. Now, if we, let's say, jump 10 degrees Celsius, then it would be a problem. But currently, it wouldn't be that bad if the temperature went up a little bit, because it was higher in the past, and there are people that live to tell the tale. There are people who lived just fine. There are people who prospered in those times. So, is it a problem? Not currently. No, it's not. It'll only be a problem when it reaches to actual danger levels, which it hasn't. And by the looks of it, it isn't going to, if your prediction is that the temperature is going to rise by a fraction of a degree in 100 years, or maybe even a decade. It's not going to be that bad. You just need to keep aware of what's happening, and if a time does come when it does become a problem, when human activities are actually big enough to cause a constant uprise in temperature, then that is when you have to take countermeasures. However, these climate alarmists, as some of them call them, definitely don't really deserve all the funding that they're getting, because number one, some of them are very deceptive in how they present their information. Number two, what they're actually arguing against isn't exactly that bad a thing. And number three, they need to really work on their scientific method a bit more. But that's my opinion. If you disagree with any of my answers to any of the questions, except for the first one, because how could you possibly disagree with something that is just stated as a plain fact? Or if you think that there's something more to discuss on one of the questions, and you want me to make a follow-up video, or you just got in late and you wanted to ask a question, but the video came out too soon for that, then feel free to ask a question. I will be glad to answer or to offer any discussion that anyone would like to see. So anyway, thank you all, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltos over and out.